From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
So much to say on a day like this. Thank you so much to Sharry Markson. Looking forward to a big hour ahead. Now, as you know, we've been told one thing over and over and over and over again for the best part of the past 10 years when it comes to electricity and prices.
The cheapest form of new energy, which is renewables.
The cheapest form of energy available.
The cheapest form of new energy is renewables.
Renewables are the cheapest form of energy.
But of course, all of that ignores the extreme cost in building a new electricity grid. The millions of solar panels, the hundreds of thousands of wind turbines, the changes to our natural environment, but all of that seems to have just been ignored. This is the cost of transition. And today, we learnt via a union superannuation-funded news site, that's the funding behind the New Daily website, they're quoting from the CSIRO, who today came up with a new poll. The new poll claimed that almost 9 in 10 Australians want a faster or more moderate transition to clean energy, that we want more renewables, let's get there faster, let's get to the cheaper form of energy. The CSIRO on Wednesday released a survey on its attitudes towards, nationwide attitudes towards the renewable energy transition. Now, contained in this report, and one of the reasons I start the show with it tonight, is because in the same way there were the misleading claims about how many Indigenous people supported the Voice going into the last referendum. Remember, the number of 80% was based off a poll that had such a small sample size, no one could suggest that that was a credible number. Yet the number was repeated over and over and over again by those who wanted a yes vote. Of course, the country saw through that, and 60-40 they voted no. But get ready for a new talking point which you are going to hear rammed down your throat between now and 2030, now and 2050. And it comes from this CSIRO polling, but again, the sample sizes are all very small, and there's a big asterisk on this next claim. But get ready for this talking point, because it's the first time you're going to hear it. More than 80% of Australians say they would tolerate living within 10 kilometres of renewable energy infrastructure. Now, all of this is, of course, a direct pushback against the protests which we have seen from country towns like Mudgee in New South Wales, all the way up to the tippy tops of Queensland, to the very base of Victoria, to even Bob Brown fighting against wind farms in Tasmania because of the birds that they will kill. Yet this talking point that now 80% of Australians, the extreme majority, would be fine to live near the new renewable energy infrastructure, of course, is based off the idea and the likelihood and the expectation that the extreme majority of Australia's population will not be living within 10 kilometres of any of these projects. Because unless they're planning to put renewable energy projects in the local dog park, unless there's a plan to change the local netball court, unless North and South Head of Sydney Harbour are about to change, unless some national parkland is going to be taken up in the suburbs of Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane, the reality is that you are not going to be living anywhere near a wind farm or a solar farm if you live in suburban Australia, let alone built up or teal Australia. But this talking point is going to be rammed down your throat. That every time you see a protest, the response will be, well, no, 8 out of 10 people completely disagree with those people. But the reality is that not 8 out of 10 people are looking down the barrel of a wind farm here and a wind farm there and a wind farm and over here and over there and a solar farm back there, something changing the landscape, let alone the insurability. There were stories this week about farmers who are unable to get fire insurance because they live near a wind turbine. Now again, I have never on this program pretended that there is not a problem that needs to be dealt with by having 8 billion people on the planet and the inevitable consequences to the planet. But I've also been absolutely proportionate that Australia is 1% of the world's problem. Yet the huge changes that are planned to regional areas, in part because they don't vote Labor, so a Labor government doesn't care how annoyed they get. The only time there seems to be a review or a change is if you are within 10 kilometres of a Labor seat. If not, then you're being told, suck it up, this is the future, shut up. But again, would they have that attitude to the people who live in Marrickville, who have just as much right to maintain their suburb as the people of Mudgee do? Of course not. There would be no such attempt to force a change to Centennial Park in Sydney. No such attempt to change the parklands of Melbourne. Instead, there is a real city-country divide. But on top of all of that, the one thing that I have demanded that people who demand the change are honest about is the cost of transition. Now, the very same organisation that is trying to tell us there's an opinion poll that 8 out of 10 people are okay to live within 10 k's of something that will never be built near where they actually live in suburban or built-up capital cities, as a talking point to push back against the regional areas where huge numbers of people do not want to see this stuff change on their lands, is that we have to talk about the cost of moving from one electricity grid that has served us to the new one that they hope will service us into a future with more people and a future with more things dragging on the supply of electricity. Everything from how we cook our food to how we charge our car, let alone the huge amount of new homes that would be required as well, as big Australia takes us towards the best part of 40 million people. Now, the true cost in 2018 from the CSIRO was $1 trillion. Green energy groups say that it could be more than $1 trillion. Now, at some point in time, someone somewhere has had to be honest and to say that it is not a costless change. As I have argued from the day this discussion started, you will either pay for it via government, and we know that Chris Bowen has got the best part of $60 billion to try to prop up some of these projects, and that's just the start, but it's all off budget, meaning we don't get to see what the cost of it is. By their own admission, the government says we need to rewire the nation, but of course they say that can only be done for a bare few $1 million, when the reality is that it is, well, hundreds of billions of dollars because of the way the power lines work, about power lines just moving power in one direction as opposed to going back and forth between the local battery storage or the multiple other ways to get to the central hubs. Let's not bore everyone with how the electricity grid works. Or it was to be paid for by you, the customer, as companies slowly but surely are forced by government, by politics, by the market to move out of the energy systems that we have had in the country for the ones that people believe we should have in the country. All I have ever asked is that if you told people up front, we're going to make a change, it's going to cost $1 trillion, but we think for the good of the planet this is what should be done. Instead, you were lied to. Instead, we had a Prime Minister who told you that the cost of power was going to go down. In fact, remember the promise that he made over and over again as he started the supercharging of this process, where the true cost of transition was going to cost billions, but he claimed it would save you hundreds.
Households will benefit by $275 on average. Reducing power prices by $275. Prices by $275. $275. $275 a year. $275 a year.
It's one of the greatest lies that have ever been told in Australian politics. And it was all about lipstick on the pig, because the pig was the billions of dollars. The lipstick was, oh, but you're going to get 275 by 2025. Now, remember, it's not based off the record highs, minus 275. We can show you the tape. We've got it. Don't worry, I'll be ramming that down people's throats. We've got the tape that shows it was from the day they came to power, minus 275. Well, today somebody actually told the truth. Now, they will be frankly, ignored by much of the mainstream media because politically the horse has bolted. Because politically this is what we're doing. Every state government has got a target on renewable energy. Every major energy company is in the middle of transition right now. But the bloke who runs one of the power companies, Alinta, actually told us the truth today. Something that the Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, wouldn't say now or before an election. Something the Prime Minister wouldn't own up to now or before the election. Which is the hard truths about the net zero transition is everything is going to cost more. And we're only just at the start of that process. Here he was today in Canberra.
Whether we pay through the tax base or pay the large upfront cost of an EV or batteries and solar, or we're paying more for electricity from the grid, we'll all pay more in aggregate. We need to be honest about that.
Now, I don't know whether he was media managed there, where if you keep reading off the notes, it'll be a bit harder for face-friendly television to end up running the grab in the 6 p.m. news. But he said the truth that no one ever wants to own up to, the truth that is apparently irrelevant, but the consequences of higher power bills, they affect everything from whether a small business remains open to what money you have to spend on other things for your family. Let alone a manufacturing sector. Power bills are inextricably linked to almost every part of what happens in the country. Now, if Australia had gone to an election and had decided that we're all going to hold our hands and we're all going to go through the pain because out on the other side there's a better future, then okay. But that's not what happened. Now, history will, of course, be written by the lefties, policed by the lefties, reinforced by the media umpires. But the truth was, you were promised prices would go down. They have gone up. The cost of transition is bigger than anyone was ever willing to admit. And they cannot pretend that something has shifted or changed, or a war in Ukraine, or what's been happening in Israel and Gaza has any impact on this whatsoever. There was a cost to this transition. It always has been there. But today we learn that even the march towards 2030, 2050, well, even if we do all of this stuff and spend all of this money, we still may not get there.
Capital costs more. Labour costs more. Transmission costs are rising. But there are going to be alternatives. Electricity might cost more, but your petrol bill might disappear. Does that mean we won't get there? I think it's challenging, as I said. Would I stand here today in 2024 looking out to 2050 and tell you something can't be done? No, I wouldn't. But I can tell you that absent some significant changes along the way, we will struggle.
The absolute truth is that Australia is 1% of the world's emissions problem. Does the world need to do something about its emissions problem? You bet. But does a country that's already got $1 trillion in debt need to spend another $1 trillion moving from one energy grid to the other? I don't know. But what I definitely know is that there is not an even pain being felt across the entire country of this transition. Yeah, lots of people are putting solar panels on their roofs and they're putting a battery in their garage to hopefully bring their individual bills down. Maybe we will get to a scenario where if enough houses have got enough solar batteries and it'll all feed into a battery at the end of the street, and slowly but surely suburbs will take care of themselves. But the suburbs are not going to be changing in the way that the regions are going to be forced to change. And I cannot stand a country that claims to be a place where everyone is equal, that treats people differently because of where they live, and in this case, because of how they vote. The cost of transition is significant. The fact that no one has engaged with it and no one follows up with it, and our political class just march past it, is a disgrace. Now, on the program last night, we spent a little time talking about the treaty negotiations, which are beginning to play out in Victoria. Now, as I said last night, and I'll reinforce again tonight, same bloke, just slightly different shirt, which is that there needs to be an end road to what we're trying to achieve here, about trying to form a new future between old and newer cultures. But of course, the reality is that there's a lot of people who are multi-generational Australians who do not feel that we should achieve that by treating one part of the country different because of its history compared to the majority of the country, let alone somebody who has arrived here in one generation. They've now had kids who, of course, are now growing up amongst us as Australians. Well, there was quite a reaction to that conversation last night. A lot of aggro on the internet, but that's okay. We lead with our chin. We will speak uncomfortable truths because they need to be said, and we're up for the debate. It did big business today at skynews.com.au, and I suggest go back and have a look at it, and please share it around with your friends if you agree with the point I was trying to make, which was while many states are going to splutter in the negotiation process, Victoria is marching away with it right now. A person who has been very significant in those negotiations addressed the Indigenous Assembly of Victoria on Friday with a list of what she believes should become the reality of the treaty, dare I say the wish list that she's put in place. That includes that Indigenous people should be exempt from land tax, they should not pay stamp duty tax, they should be out of council rates. They should be able to get interest-free loans. Now, whether this is from financial institutions who obviously have to pay to borrow money from other financial institutions to offer a loan, which is why interest is charged, and the only way they make a profit is that interest being a little higher at times than what the Reserve Bank says. The suggestion, again, was dedicated seats for Indigenous people on councils. Are these to be voted by all citizens, just by the Indigenous representatives or Indigenous citizens in those local government areas? Does it add to the overall number of seats in a council? Do they become the casting vote? All of that is up for debate. All of that is a big change in the way that we have run our country. Well, today, the woman who was behind that list, behind that speech that we spent some time on last night, well, she fronted up, and good on her for doing so, but she fronted up today to talk to Tom Elliott on 3AW, their morning's host. And she slightly backed away from the way that things were being presented on Friday, but she says this is all just an idea.
What you're talking about, my aspirations, on what I think should be involved in a statewide treaty.
Sure.
This is not official. I don't know what the state government and the First Peoples Assembly have. I don't think anything's been put on the table just yet.
And why should Indigenous people not have to pay the same housing taxes as the rest of the country?
Aboriginal people, as you well know, Tom, for 250 years, in the early days of colonisation, our people were controlled by governments. We weren't even seen as citizens until 1967. So but the other thing that our people were not, it was illegal for Aboriginal people or families to own property. So we couldn't create wealth that could be handed down from generation to generation.
It's all an idea, but it's an idea, of course, that the Victorian Premier has said she is not willing to rule anything in or out of. Now, at some point, the very concept of a treaty, the very concept of an agreement between two parties means someone has to meet somewhere in the middle. So the idea that there's not going to be some financial level to this, well, of course, we all know that is going to be part of this, whether it becomes lump sum payments, whether it becomes community payments, or whether it becomes exemptions from the taxes everyone else pays. Again, this is all what we will see play out in the treaty process. But unlike an Act of Parliament, which can be undone by a new government, this process has to be done in the open. We have to see the meetings that are taking place. There have to be people in the room to be able to tell us what is being traded. Now, I understand not all of this should happen before a television camera because not everything's a performance, but we need to know. Because just in the same way you are televising Parliament, when a law is being put in, one side says why we need it, one says why we don't, then we get into people explaining their positions, then people end up voting. We need to see that process play out because it is a fundamental change to our country. Whether you consider it to be a change for the better or worse is all up to you, but it is going to be one heck of a change. Now, news out of Tassie is that finally, what feels like many, many weeks, but still it's not, okay, it's been a long time. Jeremy Rockliff will remain as the Premier of Tasmania. We know that because, of course, the Labor Party nowhere near being able to cobble together some sort of a coalition. Well, guess what happened today? Formally, the Jackie Lambie Network members, 3 of them, have added together with a couple of other independents, and they are now going to back in the Rockliff government. Now, again, in the interests of transparency, what I was quite interested in was that unlike the arrangement that kept Julia Gillard in power for 3 years, Jeremy Rockliff today actually released the document. These are the terms and the conditions by which his government will be held in office, and that's all available on his Twitter feed. For my sins, I've actually read the document, the deal, the contract between the Jackie Lambie MPs, the Premier and the Liberal Party. Now, what's interesting about all of this is a couple of clauses, including a poison pill in here that the media, if they've reported at all, they are reporting it at the very, very, very bottom of the story. All right. The first thing here is that they maintain the right to, while keeping the government in power, and they will not vote for the government to fall. They obviously say that they would be willing to vote against government legislation, but they will have to give the government written response 24 hours heads up before a vote in the Parliament, so there's not going to be little shocks while things take place. There's also a suggestion that the members should be able to lobby directly to the Treasurer for spending to happen in their electorates. That's nothing particularly controversial, but expected there. Also, however, there's going to be an increase in the number of staff, so they're not going to have as many people as the opposition. In fact, they're going to end up with more than shadow ministers because they're going to have not quite a function in government, but because they're the people needing to keep an eye on every single thing in order to pass it. They're going to be given a total of 4 extra full-time staffers. That's for the 3 MPs, so 1 each plus 1 over the top. There's also going to be a special version of a royal commission which is going to happen. It's going to be a commission of inquiry into the Tasmanian government's responses to child sexual abuse in institutional settings. So a royal commission specifically about Tasmania in relation to that is going to be the most obvious thing that happens, the most obvious price the government will pay. But then Section 8, number 2, don't really know my legal documents that well, but still. The agreement will be reviewed 12 months after the date it comes into effect. So we have signatures, we have a government, but we have a promise that in Tasmania it will only exist for 1 year. And finally tonight, before we get into the debate, and it's going to be a doozy this evening, Bronwyn Bishop's going to be here, Stephen Conroy, Megyn Kelly in a few minutes' time. Huge news in the United States that is going to, in my view, completely reshape the upcoming presidential election. Now, I've said to you, and I've explained in laborious detail because I want you to know the ins and outs of their system rather than just it's the vote between the MAGA man and the guy who can't walk up the steps properly. The reality is that there are issues and issues that will totally move things around. But I want to talk about the issue that is going to change the game in Arizona. Now, Arizona is the state from which John McCain was the senator for a long period of time, obviously the nominee in 2008. Now, what you can see here is that in 2016, Trump won the state by about 4 points, a traditionally Republican state. Then, thanks to many of the John McCain people actually campaigning against Trump, they ended up voting with Biden and less than 1%. And the question mark is what's going to happen this year. Now, essentially, it is very difficult for Donald Trump to get to 270 electoral votes unless he has Arizona in the pocket. Now, according to the latest polls, that would seem to be where things are trending, with him leading by 3, 5, 8 and 7 on multiple polls which have been running since February. But what is the issue that I told you that has turned deep red places on its head? It's the issue of abortion. Now, in Australia, thankfully, we do not have the same politics that they do, but there was a huge court decision which was made in Arizona yesterday. Now, as you know, the Supreme Court made its decision to send everything back to the states. Well, a poison pill had been put in a piece of legislation which had set an abortion rule at 15 weeks in Arizona that if the Supreme Court had overturned it, then they go right back to 0, to essentially total ban every circumstance on abortion. Well, that law has gone up and down and appealed and all the rest of it. It made it to the Supreme Court. The law has now been upheld, which means Roe versus Wade flipped at the federal court, so we go back to the standard before Arizona was even a state. Now, this automatically means that abortion, which is an issue that outpolls the pro-lifers in Arizona, so now the Democrats say we can win this state. Literally, yesterday we were 8 points down. Today, we could be as much as 5 points up on this issue alone. So Kamala Harris has been sent to the area and she is campaigning hard in and on this issue specifically. Now, as I've shown you before, if all the polls are correct right now, you end up with Donald Trump at about 300 electoral votes. But if you go and have a look at how abortion polls in all of those swing states, if it became the dominant issue, Biden wins by 300 electoral votes. The reason I talk about this in the tone that I do right now is because something that was also held up by the Arizona Supreme Court is that there will be a referendum in Arizona on the issue of abortion on the same day as the presidential election. So even if lefties don't want to back in Biden because of Israel, even if lefties don't want to back in Biden because he's too old, they will turn up in droves to vote to change the standard on abortion. And that is a very bad day for Trump and the Republicans. We'll get into our debate in a moment or two's time, but as always, a reminder, Megyn Kelly's going to be on the show in but just a moment or two's time. But with the gang tonight, let's talk about this idea about the race-based taxing that may well be the case. Some people pay, some people don't. Treaty and a whole lot more. But I promise we'll be keeping the war chat to a minimum. In fact, it won't exist for the rest of the show. More in a sec. Well, this would be round 3 weeks in a row, and it was a fun fight the first week. It stabled in the second. Let's see what happens in the third round. The third round could be the killer here. Who knows? But everyone, to your corners. We've inspected the gloves, and they're ready to go, okay? Let's get ready to rumble, as they would say, which I think is actually trademarked, I apologise, Michael Buffer. None other than Bronwyn Bishop and Stephen Conroy, both coming in hard from the respective ends of the M or SCG. So today we see with power prices that Alinta Energy is out there saying what no lefty's been willing to say, which is that there is a cost of transition rather than there's such a benefit to transition that everything's cheaper. Well, we knew that at the start. But also opinion polling today about whether nuclear power would be considered to be cheaper. This comes via the Financial Review, and they say that the best part of 34% of people believe that it will actually end up being cheaper than renewables. Just 17% of people disagree. The vast majority are like the rest of us going, I don't know. But it's interesting here because the politics, and we could talk about the politics of nuclear reactors, which is no one wants one in their backyard, but Peter Dutton is slowly but surely getting to a place of trying to tell us where they may be. I hope they also turn around and say that if a local government area bids for it, you can have free power for 20 years, but we'll see what happens. But what did you take most interest out of today? That poll or what was said by Alinta today?
Well, what Alinta said today was the final denouement. Truth is being told. And I have said all along, right from when I was still in the Parliament arguing against these policies, that the cost of electricity is what it costs to get it from the generator or the point of generation to your house or your business. That's the cost. And for this perpetual lie to say that it's the cheapest form of electricity is just that, a lie. So by looking at both those pieces of evidence, both the poll and what Alinta's had to say, all the things that many of us here on Sky and elsewhere predicted are all absolutely true. So the real question that should be put to people in a poll is, do you want cheap, reliable electricity that comes from coal until we get nuclear, or do you want expensive, unreliable electricity that comes from destroying forests, seabeds and productive land Which would you prefer?
Well, this is
That's the real distinction.
But also something that we have seen in polling, we saw it before the last election. You certainly remember from the inside of the Labor Party, Stephen, the polling, which has consistently told us for a generation, when faced between saving the planet or how much you're willing to pay for it, there's a moment where Australians balk at the cost. Now, at the last election, again, 275, lipstick on the pig, let's sort of pretend that there's nothing but savings. Reality, 2 years into that project, you've got the companies coming out and saying this is going to cost a lot of money. You've got the CSIRO saying it's going to cost $1 trillion. Yet, why do we not see a greater friction between the people who said price would be a problem when price is a problem, that they're not pushing back on what the government is doing?
Well, I think the coalition has been trying to make that case for 14 or 15 years, and sometimes they've won elections and other times they've lost elections. Now they've got the fantasy policy called nuclear. And I mean, I just wish Bronwyn had had the courage to vote against I just wish you'd had the courage to vote against the proposition that we ban nuclear in this country, Bronwyn, because you voted for it. So, like, it's on the parliamentary Hansard.
Stephen,
you voted
that is absolutely
for the
true.
ban.
It went into legislation that John Howard put there, and it's to my shame that I have
John
to admit
Howard and you.
Absolutely. You got it wrong.
So let's just.
What did you get wrong in your votes in Parliament?
Now let's get. Oh, I got a million. I
was going to say, I've got the rest of the show if you want it.
But the key in the debate right now is nuclear has missed the window.
No, it hasn't.
If people had had courage, if Tony Abbott, if Peter Dutton had had the courage to want to argue this through the Rudd-Gillard government, or even when they were in government for the 9 years, if they just had the courage to make this case, you might be able to get it to stack up. I mean, Peter Dutton keeps getting caught. He keeps backing technologies that keep getting literally economically cancelled. Even his latest one just got dumped by the country that was advocating it in the UK. He is now advocating a policy that the country which was subsidising it, the UK, has just dumped.
No,
it couldn't even win a bid in its own country.
The point
That's
is
just a fact.
The point is this, that a lot of us have argued in favour of nuclear power. A lot of us have. But the fact of this is that every time we stood our ground and said this pursuit of renewables would bankrupt the country, we won. It was Morrison that said, no, we'll go to net zero, and went off to Glasgow. If he'd not done that and had the election beforehand, he would have won. But the bottom line is this. Now that people see that the ridiculous policies pursued by Albanese and Bowen and the mess it's landing this country in, and now you're starting to see the people who are actually responsible for getting that electricity generated and to business, houses and people. Now that we see the mess, people are prepared to listen to what is a very difficult and complicated argument. And it's been kept difficult and complicated for years because people don't want to get into that sludge and down in the weeds. But now we've got to the point where people are seeing what the reality is. And that's why the whole debate has now got traction.
I want to talk about...
It's not a lack of courage. It's been a lack of ability to cut through, which is now happening.
Yeah, sorry, mate. I wanted to talk about the Victorian treaty negotiations. Stephen, again, there's no mystery that these were coming. They were on the table as part of a conversation in relation to that state election. So, again, there's no surprise here. But I just want to, before we get into some of the details that have been around, which are now being walked back as just suggestions, all the rest of it. Now, you know that there's negotiation that happens in public and then there's negotiation that happens in private. But something as complicated as this, that is as permanent as this, shouldn't the extreme majority of the negotiation happen in public, i.e. there's a camera or there's a reporter, there's someone there to watch what is being given up or what is being demanded?
Well, look, I think that's a fair argument, and I just wish you would apply that, or Brom would apply that when it comes to the coalition agreements, especially when it's in government. This is a secret document.
What's that got to do with the treaty?
No one's even allowed to look at.
Oh, for heaven's sake,
no,
Stephen.
I'm talking about
That's
Paul
a
is
pathetic
arguing
argument.
for transparency.
Fine.
I'll get
yes,
to.
release the coalition agreement after every election. Done.
Release the coalition agreement. Good.
That's good. Release all your agreements with the trade unions.
Yeah. Okay. But let's get to the treaty part here and about how this is going to be.
The trade unions are part and parcel
I would support
embedded.
there being. Thanks, Bronwyn. I would agree that these negotiations need to be conducted in public forums. I would think it would be incredibly damaging to the concept of a treaty if issues like taxes were dictated on the basis of whether you're Indigenous or not. I can't see anything undermining support in the broader community for a treaty approach than a proposal like that.
Stephen,
so I would hope that proposal disappears very quickly.
Yeah.
Let me tell you this. Google tomorrow, tonight, and see all the things that are given to people of Aboriginal heritage against those people who do not have Aboriginal heritage. It's got nothing to do with poverty. It's got nothing to do with disadvantage. It's simply what blood is in your veins. And that's a terrible way to conduct policy. And I'll give you an example of how cruel it can be in a family.
Well, you've been in government
listen to me.
doing it for
I know
for
of a
30
family.
years.
I know of a family where that family, the mother has had 2 husbands. The first husband was of Aboriginal heritage. She had 2 children. The second husband is of non-Aboriginal heritage. She had another 2 children. The 2 children by the first husband get so much. The other 2 children get nothing. This isn't a rich family. This isn't a privileged family. This is a family that has to struggle. That is injustice. That shows a gap which is not acceptable. There are so many things that have crept in that people don't even know exist, advantages that are given. And so when I look at this treaty being done, again on the basis of race, when we've had the referendum where the people of Australia said, no, we don't want this sort of country. We want everybody to have access and the right to aspire and the right to be successful. We don't want it divided on the basis of race. And yet there's Victoria, who's with a new Premier who's looking just pathetic.
And the Queensland Liberals, the New South Wales Liberals, and the South Australian Liberals.
I will criticise whoever, but at the out it is only Victoria.
And the Victorian Liberals.
The Liberals in
Liberals
Queensland,
have stepped out of it, haven't they? The Queensland Libs have too.
And they've said no, they won't do it.
That's my point.
No, absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. We only are where we are because of those votes.
However, they are saying in Queensland they will abolish it.
Correct.
And in South Australia, they've come out and said that the voice that has been set up will be abolished. And yet in Victoria, this whole treaty question is going ahead. Now, it's a slap in the face to the people who voted in that referendum, a slap in the face. And we've really got to have some sense in this country that says we are one nation of people who love our country, and warts and all, history and all.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disagree with Bronwyn on a really fundamental point, because, Paul, you made the point. The Victorian government did not hide at the last election this was its policy. This is a policy the Victorian government were elected on.
It had a different
Premier. Doesn't matter.
Yes, it does matter.
Was part of the package. The policy was part of the package the Victorian people voted for, whether you like it or you don't like it. So don't Bronwyn try and say the Victorian public are slapping people in the face.
Yes, they were,
voted for
because
Labor
the
government
referendum
committed to
came
this policy.
after that. The referendum came after that. And also, when you look at the opposition in Victoria, why are you surprised they didn't win?
Yeah, that's a very fair point. All right, guys, I'm out of time. Can we do round 4 next week? Remember, it's 12 rounds. Thank you very much. We'll get it all the way to 52 rounds if we can. None other than Stephen Conroy, Bronwyn Bishop again. Thank you very much. We'll talk on even bigger issues, ageism, China, all the rest of it in the coming weeks. Now, the wonderful Megyn Kelly, getting ready to have a chat with her about everything from the way the media works to a little bit of Beyonce. Why not? All that and a whole lot more with the great lady next here. Don't go anywhere. Megyn's next. Favourite time of the week, the reason we broadcast in HD, none other than the wonderful Megyn Kelly joining us from the United States. Of course, the show Sirius XM, or you can find it on podcast and YouTube. How are you, Rockstar?
I'm so good. Wonderful to be back with you.
Lovely to see you. So, NPR. Now, in Australia, we have, one of the biggest media players is fully taxpayer funded. NPR is not quite as fully funded as a BBC or an ABC, but it's got an awful lot of money in it, as well as a bunch of donations. But basically, it's a bunch of people who've been whispering at us and having a conversation. And somebody from the inside has now turned around and said, the people there are nuts.
Yes, it's extraordinary. So I read this guy's post in the Free Press, and I'm reading it, and he starts out by saying he works there, currently works there. And I love how he begins it by establishing his bona fides as a leftist. Just so we all know, this is not some secret conservative who somehow managed to find his way into NPR. Listen to this, Paul. He says, I'm a Sarah Lawrence educated, was raised by a lesbian peace activist mother. I drive a Subaru, and Spotify says my listening habits are most similar to people in Berkeley. I fit the NPR mold. So there he's got us. Okay, I accept him as a leftist. I agree so far. Right. And then he just rips the organization to shreds as having completely lost its journalistic way. He says at one point he went and did a little poll to see what were the voting registrations of the people who work in the D.C. bureau of NPR. And it was 87 registered Democrats working in editorial positions. Guess how many Republicans? 0. Bupkis. Not one. He raised this with higher ups. No one cared. The president wouldn't take a meeting with him. Like, the ideological bias is not a problem. He talked about how their coverage of Donald Trump really did them in, and how they went from covering a president to actually trying to topple a president. Then they lost their minds after George Floyd, and of course, changed the entire mission of NPR from journalism to DEI, everything. Everything needs to be about race and gender and so on. It didn't do anything to change a single viewer's listening habits or watching habits of NPR. They didn't increase their Black watchers, their Hispanic watchers at all, because newsflash, NPR, Blacks and Hispanics are just like whites. They just want to be entertained and find out news that's going to affect their real lives, like their pocketbook and their immigration concerns and so on. They're not obsessed with your weird woke DEI stories, which NPR is learning, but apparently not internalizing. And so he goes through this saga that really leaves you completely flabbergasted at how lost this group is. On the identity front, okay, I've got to read this to you, okay? He lists the number of like BIPOC, et cetera, DEI groups that they now have at NPR. You've got to hear it to believe it. The marginalized genders and intersex people of color. The mi gente, meaning Latinx employees at NPR. NPR Noir. That's the Black employees. There's no NPR Blanc, for the record. The Southwest Asians and North Africans at NPR. The Ummah for the Muslims. The women, gender expansive and transgender people. Why do we have to get lumped with the transgenders? The Kevra for the Jewish. The NPR Pride, which is LGBTQIA, and we could keep going. They don't have any time to do any news reporting. All they have time to do is meet with their affinity groups. And this is why he accurately points out that they used to have Republican viewers. It used to be kind of split. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Republicans, independents, and Democrats at NPR. And now it's 2/3 Democrats and 1/3 people who thought they were tuning into something else. I mean, it's lost. And this is just one example, but this could be extrapolated to any one of the mainstream media outlets in our country and probably yours too.
So Beyonce's in her country phase right now. Okay. I get it. You know, this ain't Texas, it ain't Hold'em. My kids just say that over and over and over and over and over again. It's a nice start to a song. But the next version has a bit of Dolly Parton's Jolene in it, but apparently this is empowering. Has she actually read the words that she was singing?
Can I tell you something? Like, why do we have to... It's fine that they make a queen out of Beyonce. I don't totally understand why. I mean, she's a good singer. She's talented. I don't deny that. Why does it have to be, yes, Queen Bey? No, she's not a queen. People like her music. She sings some good music. That's it, okay? She didn't cure cancer. She's not Marie Curie. Calm down. But so now she decides to take a step into the country lane, and it's like country music has been remade. It's remade. Is it? Okay, we have a new player in country music. Country music's been around for a long, long time. It goes right to the heart of America. And most Americans in red states have been loving and enjoying it long before Queen Bey decided to stick her big toe into the lane. But fine, okay, she comes over. She makes an album, which, of course, because she's queen, has gotten the thumbs up and the promotion from Michelle Obama, from Vice President Kamala Harris, from Paul McCartney, from Dolly Parton herself. She's no dummy. She called everybody and said, I need you to do me this favor and say you love my album, which they did.
Back me in.
But she takes Jolene, which is such a catchy song by Dolly Parton. And Jolene, one of the most interesting thing about that song, in addition to its catchy tune, is the story it tells. It tells the story of a very insecure woman who sees another woman who she thinks and strongly believes is much more attractive than she is, with her auburn hair and her green eyes.
I love the auburn hair
She
line.
knows, and she knows Jolene can steal her man away. Now, this doesn't say good things about her man, but she knows that it could happen. And instead of like going over and threatening Jolene, what she does is begs Jolene not to take her man away. She begs her, saying, I know you could do it, but I'm begging you, please don't, because for me, he's the only guy there is. And that's an interesting window into an insecure woman's heart. And it's also kind of clever because she flatters Jolene like it's a smart but insecure woman. Anyway, that's the story of the song, or at least it used to be. Queen Bey got her hands on the song, and God forbid she sing anything that make her look less than, all empowered with the muscle. And so now she's got to change it to, if you come by my man, I'm basically going to beat the hell out of you. I'm going to beat you up. Those are right? Like, take that, biatch. And she uses the B word in the song. Ooh. And she turned Jolene into her version of a badass, because that's what modern day feminism looks like. By the way, completely missing that the true power move is to write a song about Jolene not even worrying about this. Jolene has no worries because her man loves her and is committed to her and would never cheat on Jolene. So the most beautiful woman in the world could come walking by. She's good. But Queen Bey doesn't understand that. She's got to pretend she's tough, which only telegraphs to those of us who are paying attention that she isn't. The whole thing is bass-ackwards, and I object.
Now, I was really looking forward to tomorrow night's show being an all-star show. That is going to happen, but it'll be in a couple of weeks' time due to some travel arrangements of one of our guests. So looking forward to it. It will be happening, not tomorrow night, but again into the future. Now, can I show you the Australian of the day? His name is Paul, and he lives on the sunny coast. Now, his dad had a Monaro, one of the great Australian cars, and he loved driving around and fixing it up, hanging out with his dad in this beautiful Monaro. He even went on to have his own Monaro, I believe, in the 90s. Well, he's decided to fix it up like many an Aussie bloke does, ladies as well, can I dare say, Charlotte, as well, would swing a spanner and bring a great car back to life. But what makes Gary the Australian of the day is because you see what he's done with the car now? He stores it in his living room. Not in the garage, the living room. He was inspired by some movie that he watched and he'd forgotten how it all works. But every day, if he wants to take it for a little drive, out the sort of sliding doors, and then he brings it back in. Now, I'll be honest, I love this idea. Not sure the family member watching TV would love the idea of the broom broom and the smoke being left behind, but that's fine. You are the Australian of the day, not just for doing something your dad did, not doing something that you loved, but being able to rub everyone else's nose in it. Well done to you, Gary.